Greetings, grade 10s. Now we are going to introduce functions. So as we start on functions, there are some things that we need to know, new terms, new words that you will see, new ways of doing things. So let's look at that. So functions, what are they? What is a function? So a function is a relationship or a relation between the input and output values. Remember in grade 9 we were looking at x and y values being the input x values and the output y values. So their characteristics of a function is that each input variable has only one output variable. Can you see? Each input variable has one output variable. So that is one of the characteristics of functions. Some of them, one output value, right, has only one input value. One input value has got only one output value. And another characteristic of some of the function is that you will see that different input values have got only one output value. Different input values, variables or values can have the same output variable. Don't worry about this. We are going to explore them a little later. Now, let's look at how we can express the relationship of input and output variables in functions. So you see that there are three ways in which we can express the relation of the input and the output variables, right? So the first one, we are going to use what we call the mapping diagram, where we have got the input values on the left and the output values on the right, and we use some blocks, right? In these blocks we will put the input values, and the left block we put the output values or the y values, and we map them. So we will show the relationship, which means one input value, like in this case, is mapped to one output value. So it shows that which input value is related to -2, which input value is related to the -1, and so on. So -2 is mapped to -1, -2 is mapped to -6. -1 is mapped to -3, 0 is mapped to 0, 1 is mapped to 3, 2 is mapped to 6. You remember we were doing these functions in grade 9, right? We sometimes use the equations, sometimes they use those boxes to show a machine way of doing things where there is input, a process takes place, and then output. So here we are just trying to show you how we can express the relation between the input and output values. So that one is what we call the mapping diagram. And then we have what we call the way of using what we call set of ordered pairs or coordinates, like we used to know when you were doing graphic. Right. So this is called the ordered pair. Ordered pairs, you see that we have the x and y values paired up inside brackets. So we call that the ordered pairs, like that. So you see -2 which is an x value, is paired with -6, which is a y value. X value is the input value, y value is the output value. So we pair them inside brackets to show that when x is -2, then your y, which is the output value, will be -6. And the third way we express the relationship between input and output value is the table of values. Right? The table of values uses columns, two rows actually, and several columns. So the upper row is input values, the y values, and the lower row is the output values, the y values. And then we've got different columns with the paired up values, input and output values. So when x is -2, y is -6. When x is -1, y is -3. When x is 0, y is 0. When x is 1, y is 3. When x is 2, y is 6. So in grade 8 and 9 we've been talking about input and output values, but you see that now when we are dealing with functions, we would tend to use the terms different terms actually. So please pay attention to these ways of expressing the relationship between input and output values, because there's an activity coming very soon after this video, right? And then let's look at the terms that we use in place of input values, in place of output values. So you see that these terms are domain and range values. So when we are talking about domain, this is the set of all input values of a function. So all set of input values of a function, you call it a domain. So input values are usually the independent variables. So we call that the domain. So on a Cartesian plane, we usually refer to the domain as the values on the horizontal axis or the x-axis, right? And these are the input values. So domain refers to the input values. And then range, this refers to the set of all output values of a function, right? And you see that these are usually the dependent variables. They depend on what domain value you have put into the equation or a function for you to get the range. So these are the y values, and usually on a Cartesian plane, they are those values on the vertical axis or y-axis. So you must know, when we are talking about domain, we are talking about the input values, the x values, when we are talking about the Cartesian plane. And then the range, these are the output values of a function, and they are dependent on the input values, the domain. And on a Cartesian plane, these are usually the values on the x-axis. So in other words, we can just say this one, the domain values, they are found on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and then the range values, they are found on the y-axis, just to give you an idea, the vertical axis. Okay, now please do an activity which on the worksheet,